At 30, your body forgave the morning. You skipped water, grabbed coffee, sat at the desk, ate nothing until noon, and the systems compensated on their own. The vagus nerve carried signals at full capacity, firing the gastrocolic reflex from coffee alone. The insulin response cleared a glucose spike in minutes, the receptors sensitive, the transporters fast, the pancreas working within a margin it never announced. The fascia between every muscle layer liquefied during sleep without a single conscious movement, because the lubricant was abundant and the overnight cooling was not enough to gel it beyond what a few steps could reverse. The bones maintained their architecture from walking forces alone. The crystalline lens passed every wavelength of morning sunlight straight through to the retina, without filtering. You woke and the day started without negotiation. Bowels moved on schedule. The stiffness lasted 3 steps, and energy carried through to noon without food, because every system had margin to spare, and none of them required your attention. You never noticed any of it, because forgiveness is silent. After 50, every one of those systems runs at a lower baseline. The vagus nerve has lost signaling capacity that accumulated across decades without a single symptom announcing the loss. The insulin response has slowed, the postprandial spike climbing higher and lasting longer with each passing year. The fascia gels thicker overnight because the lubricant that keeps it fluid is declining in production year by year. The bones lose density without mechanical forces the morning routine no longer provides. The crystalline lens has yellowed, filtering the blue wavelengths your circadian clock depends on before they reach the cells that detect them. None of these changes arrived as events. They arrived as gradients, each one so slow it presented as normal aging rather than as a system losing the margin it once had. The forgiveness stopped. The morning that ran itself at 30 requires specific inputs at 55, inputs that activate compensatory mechanisms still operating at full capacity inside systems that have declined around them. 6 inputs, 6 systems that have declined, 6 compensations that still work if they receive the right signal in the first hour. Most mornings those signals arrive late, in the wrong order, or not at all. What happens inside your body when each one arrives on time is the physics underneath the morning most people have never been taught. What happens when cold water reaches an empty stomach before anything else? You have felt the sequence, the cold that moves downward behind the sternum, the settling in the upper abdomen, the bowel movement that arrives within 30 minutes, more reliably than coffee, more reliably than fiber, more reliably than anything else in the morning. The physics underneath begins at a receptor in the stomach lining called TRPM8, a cold-sensing ion channel that opens when liquid between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius contacts the mucosal surface. The channel opens. Calcium ions flood through the pore. The signal travels upward through the vagus nerve to the brainstem. Simultaneously, stretch receptors in the gastric wall detect the volume of water distending the stomach. 2 signals, thermal and mechanical, arriving through a shared nerve simultaneously, produce multimodal summation in the brainstem, a parasympathetic output to the colon that is disproportionately larger than either signal alone would generate. And the reflex is strongest after an overnight fast because the gastric stretch receptors have been at resting baseline for 7 or 8 hours. The first distension they detect after that silence produces the largest afferent signal of the entire day. The stomach has been waiting for input. Cold water delivers 2 inputs through one nerve at once. The cold receptor amplifies a nerve signal that has been weakening for decades. Vagal tone declines approximately 1% per year after 30. By 65, roughly 35% of peak capacity is gone. The gastrocolic reflex weakens. Morning regularity becomes unpredictable. You never thought about digestion at 30. At 60, you wonder why the morning pattern changed. But TRPM8 does not decline with the nerve it signals through. Ion channels rebuild through normal cellular turnover on a timescale of days. The TRPM8 receptor lining the stomach at 65 is as responsive as it was at 30. When cold water activates it, the strong receptor compensates for the weak nerve. The signal that a full-capacity vagus would have carried easily at 30 now depends on the amplification that TRPM8 multimodal summation provides. The thermal channel that multiplies the signal only opens below approximately 25 degrees. Warm water stretches the stomach and fires the volume signal alone. Cold water fires too, through a weakened nerve. That difference determines whether the gastrocolic reflex reaches the colon or fades before it arrives. cold water on an empty stomach also addresses two overnight accumulations that converge in a single morning window. Fasting stomach acid sits at its daily peak concentration, a pH between 1 and 2. The most concentrated it will be at any point in the 24-hour cycle, while the mucosal barrier protecting the stomach wall is at minimum thickness, because the prostaglandins that rebuild it require food-derived arachidonic acid to activate their thickening response. The barrier and the acid are at opposite extremes simultaneously. Cold water dilutes the concentrated acid and begins stimulating barrier thickening before coffee arrives to challenge a barrier that has not yet rebuilt. Simultaneously, blood viscosity is at its 24-hour maximum. 300 to 500 milliliters of water lost overnight through breathing and evaporation through the skin have concentrated the blood. The viscosity peaks at waking. Morning is the peak window for acute cardiovascular events, as Muller and colleagues established in the New England Journal of Medicine, a convergence of the cortisol awakening surge, sympathetic activation, blood that clots more readily, and thickened blood arriving together in the same hour. Cold water reaches the small intestine, passes through aquaporin channels in the intestinal epithelium into the plasma, and begins diluting the concentrated blood within 15 to 20 minutes. Well inside the cardiovascular risk window that closes by mid-morning. 1 glass, 300 to 500 milliliters, refrigerator temperature. A strong receptor amplifying a weakened nerve, acid dilution before the barrier is ready, and plasma recovery during the hour when the blood is at its most thrombogenic. But TRPM8 is a channel that fires regardless of age because the protein rebuilds every few days. What about a system where the receptor itself works perfectly, but the physical barrier between the signal and the receptor has changed with every year? What happens when morning light reaches a retina that is aged? Brightness that felt sharper at 30 feels dimmer at 60 despite identical sunlight. That perception is physiologically accurate. Buried in the retina behind the rods and cones that form images, a separate population of cells does not contribute to vision at all. These cells contain a photopigment called melanopsin, tuned specifically to blue-enriched light at 480 nanometers. They detect light. They do not form images. A class of retinal cells nobody had predicted, discovered in 2002 by David Burson and colleagues at Brown University, operating as a system with a single purpose, measuring the spectral composition of ambient light and relaying that measurement directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's master circadian clock. When melanopsin detects sufficient blue wavelength light, the suprachiasmatic nucleus triggers the cortisol awakening response and initiates the circadian phase for the entire day. Every peripheral clock in the body locks onto this one morning signal. Liver, pancreas, adrenal cortex, gut, all synchronize downstream from it. Insulin sensitivity, melatonin release, core body temperature rhythm, and cortisol cycling for the next 16 hours all depend on the strength and timing of this single input through the retina. Melanopsin cells have not aged. Their firing threshold at 65 is identical to 30. What has changed sits in front of them. The crystalline lens accumulates yellow chromophores decade by decade, proteins glycated by the slow browning chemistry that stiffens collagen and cross-links tendons throughout the body. The yellowing filters blue wavelengths selectively, attenuating precisely the frequency melanopsin depends on before it reaches the retina. Lens transmittance at 480 nanometers decreases measurably with age. Outdoor brightness that fully activated melanopsin at 30 delivers a partial signal at 60. The filter between the light and the receptor has changed. The receptor behind it fires at the threshold it always did. 10 minutes outdoors delivers lux values that indoor lighting cannot approach. Even an overcast morning exceeds 10,000 lux. Indoor light at 300 to 500 lux does not activate melanopsin adequately at any age. Not through a window, which reduces lux by 50 to 80% and blocks the ultraviolet component entirely. The older eye needs brighter, longer input to achieve the circadian reset. The younger eye received effortlessly. The circadian drift that many adults experience after 50, the difficulty falling asleep, the early waking, the afternoon fatigue, is partly a consequence of a melanopsin system that still works perfectly, receiving a signal the yellowed lens attenuated before it arrived. When the morning calibration is weak, every downstream clock drifts. Insulin sensitivity peaks later than it should. Melatonin onset shifts later into the evening. Core body temperature rhythm flattens. The peripheral organs lose the timing signal that coordinates them, and the coordination loss compounds across every hour of the day that follows the missed calibration. Two inputs so far, two systems that decline, and in each case the receptor or channel that the input activates has not declined with the system it belongs to. Whether that architecture runs through every system the morning touches is the question the next four inputs answer. How does the compensation change when the problem is mechanical, when the morning itself created the deficit during the hours you slept? Stiffness in the lower back, the hips, the ankles, every morning is a state change in a lubricant, hyaluronic acid between the fascial layers, the specialized molecule that fasciocytes secrete along every gliding surface in your body, gels overnight through thixotropy. The physics that makes ketchup solid in the bottle and liquid when shaken. Movement during the day generates interfascial shear that keeps the lubricant fluid. 7 hours of sleep eliminates the shear. The lubricant gels. Adjacent fascial layers bind together. The first 3 steps creak because muscles are trying to slide past tissues that are glued by a fluid that solidified while you slept. By 60, hyaluronic acid production has declined approximately 30 to 40%. Less lubricant to begin with. What remains gels faster and thicker because the concentration of the remaining molecules increases as the total volume drops, accelerating the cross-linking that forms the gel. The relationship between concentration and viscosity is nonlinear. A small decrease in lubricant volume produces a disproportionate increase in overnight gel stiffness because the molecular chains that form the crosslinks encounter each other more frequently in a smaller volume. Older adults also move less during sleep, generating less unconscious shear to partially liquefy the gel overnight. The morning fascial state at 60 is measurably stiffer than at 30. More gel, less lubricant, longer to melt. Well, the compensation is the sequence. 60 seconds of continuous gentle oscillation, lateral sway, torso rotation, hip circles, generates interfascial shear that liquefies the gel before any stretch is applied. Stretching gelled fascia forces layers to tear against adhesion rather than slide past one another. The tears repair with disorganized collagen, stiffer than the original tissue. The morning stretch that helps for 20 minutes and then returns is the tear repair stiffen cycle, repeating daily, each cycle leaving the tissue marginally worse than the cycle before. Melt first, stretch second. The stiffness that loosens after 5 minutes of walking every morning, the gradual easing you have attributed to warming up, is the thixotropic transition completing. The gel bonds breaking under mechanical shear, the lubricant returning to its liquid state. You described the physics accurately every morning of your life without knowing the term for what was happening. Once the gel fully breaks, the fascial layers slide freely. Muscles that were pulling against adhesion now contract and extend through their full range. The first squat, the first overhead reach, the first rotation of the torso that feels unrestricted, each arrives only after the thixotropy transition completes. I swapped my morning stretch for 60 seconds of hip circles and lateral sway. The stiffness that used to return by mid-morning stopped returning. Shear before stretch. The sequence is the intervention. Fascia operates through fluid dynamics, through shear and viscosity and gel state transitions. But what does the morning look like when the physics is piezoelectric, when the signal the body needs is forced through bone? Consider the jaw you use 3 times a day. It has not worked against real resistance in years. The food that arrives at every meal has been pre-softened, pre-cut, pre-processed to the point where the masseter, the strongest muscle relative to its size in your body, generates 10 to 20 pounds of force when it could generate 100. The mandible is a piezoelectric bone. Mechanical compression generates electrical charge in the hydroxyapatite crystals embedded in the bone matrix, the piezoelectric physics that walking and heel drops generate in the femur and tibia. Piezoelectric charge directs osteoblasts to deposit new bone along the lines of maximum stress. Hard chewing at 100 pounds or more of bite force exceeds the 1000 microstrain threshold, where the electrical signal activates. Soft food does not cross that threshold. The signal never fires. The bone never receives the instruction to maintain its density. By 60, the masseter has atrophied from decades of soft food, running at roughly 13% of the capacity it would have maintained with regular hard chewing. The bone followed the muscle. Mandibular bone density has been declining without the piezoelectric signal that hard food would have generated 3 times a day for decades. and each lost tooth removes roughly 1,000 pressure sensors embedded around the root, mechanoreceptors in the periodontal ligament that detect bite force and relay it through the trigeminal nerve to the hippocampus. When a tooth is extracted, those receptors are lost permanently, and the trigeminal input to the hippocampus decreases proportionally. The relationship between tooth loss and cognitive decline is dose-dependent, as Luo and colleagues identified in 2019, each additional missing tooth correlating with measurably increased dementia risk. The proposed mechanism runs along the trigeminal hippocampal pathway. That forceful chewing activates, hard chewing drives hippocampal blood flow and stimulates production of BDNF, the growth factor that supports neuron maintenance and new cell survival, through that trigeminal nerve volley, a neural input that soft food steadily eliminated without anyone connecting the dietary shift to the cognitive decline that followed decades later. 3 minutes of bilateral hard chewing fires the piezoelectric signal through the mandible, sends the trigeminal volley to the hippocampus, and loads the masseter at forces it has not encountered since the last time food required effort. The muscle fibers that have been idling at a fraction of their capacity receive a signal that recruits motor units the modern diet never demanded. Two systems, bone architecture and cognitive input, fed by one mechanical action that soft food eliminated. I chew mastic gum now because of the Luo data. 3 minutes while the coffee brews alternating sides. The habit is unremarkable. The trigeminal hippocampal pathway underneath it is why the gum stayed. 4 inputs. But what happens when an input does more than offset one system, when it changes the trajectory of every system the morning has already touched? Each of the first 4 inputs restored one system. The final 2 changed the trajectory of every system the first 4 already touched. When protein crosses a threshold, the aging body quietly raised. That threshold moved. You have felt the change even if you never named it. The muscle that recovered in a day at 30 takes 3 days at 60. The grip that weakened without injury. The stairs that became harder with no event, no moment you can point to, nothing except the quiet withdrawal of a capacity you assumed was permanent. The physics underneath that shift is a threshold that moved without announcement. Muscle protein synthesis requires the amino acid leucine to cross a concentration threshold that activates the mTOR signaling cascade, the molecular switch that initiates new protein assembly in the muscle fiber. Below the threshold, the switch does not flip. Above it, synthesis begins. The transition is binary, the molecular equivalent of a light switch, not a dimmer. At 30, 15 grams of protein at breakfast crossed the leucine threshold easily. The concentration reached the activation point and the muscle began building new fiber within hours of the meal. After 50, the threshold rises. Anabolic resistance is the name for the shift, and the physics is specific. The leucine concentration required to activate mTOR increases with age. 15 grams of protein that robustly triggered synthesis at 30 barely registers at 60. The mTOR pathway still functions. Its activation point has moved upward. The muscle needs a higher leucine concentration per meal to trigger a response, and the breakfast that crossed the threshold for 3 decades now falls short without you noticing, because the deficit accumulates in grams of muscle lost per month rather than in a single visible event. The decline is invisible until it arrives as function, the bag that needs 2 trips, the chair that needs the armrest, the recovery that stretches from overnight to 3 days. The threshold rose, and the breakfast did not rise with it. While distributing that amount across each meal, rather than concentrating the daily total in 1 or 2 sittings, produces significantly greater 24-hour muscle protein synthesis, as Padden-Jones and colleagues at the University of Texas Medical Branch demonstrated across multiple trials. A morning meal that crosses the leucine threshold pushes the concentration above the activation line. The aging threshold drew. The switch flips. Synthesis begins. Ribosomes in the muscle fiber begin assembling new contractile proteins from the amino acids the meal provided. The process runs for roughly 3 to 5 hours before the leucine concentration drops below the threshold and synthesis returns to baseline. That window is the building window. The muscle built during that window is the only muscle the body adds from that meal. Miss it at breakfast and the muscle waits until the next meal crosses the threshold if it does. The threshold rose silently across decades, but the switch itself still works at every age if the input meets the new setting. But the threshold is the physics of one meal. What happens when the input is movement, and the movement feeds every system the morning has already restored? Muscle contraction while the glucose is still climbing. Heaviness after eating that did not exist at 30. The blood sugar that takes longer to return to baseline. The afternoon fatigue that starts at breakfast and deepens through the day. The physics connecting these begins at the GLUT4 transporter in the muscle cell membrane. GLUT4 responds to two independent signals through entirely separate pathways: insulin, the standard route, and muscle contraction, operating through the AMPK energy sensing cascade, completely independent of the insulin response that has been slowing for decades. When you walk during the postprandial glucose peak, the 20 to 40 minutes after eating when blood sugar is climbing toward its maximum, muscle contraction pulls glucose out of the blood through GLUT4, while the gut is still putting it in. The two flows partially cancel. The spike never reaches the height it would reach with quiet muscles. The glucose that quiet muscles would have left circulating, reacting with proteins, cross-linking collagen, accumulating the glycation damage that compounds across decades, is instead pulled into the muscle cell and burned as fuel. After 50, the insulin pathway has declined. The glucose from breakfast that would have been cleared within 60 minutes at 30 now sits elevated for 90 minutes or more at 60, the clearance curve stretching visibly longer with each year. Postprandial glucose peaks are higher, longer, and more damaging per minute of elevation because the Maillard reaction, the slow browning chemistry that yellowed the lens and cross-linked the collagen, runs faster at high glucose concentrations. Each additional milligram per deciliter above baseline accelerates the cross-linking disproportionately. The GLUT4 contraction pathway compensates for what insulin can no longer clear alone. The contraction-mediated pathway the meal timing discussion described in full operates at its highest value here in the first hour, when the insulin pathway has independently declined. Now the timing changes the clinical significance. 3 15-minute post-meal walks controlled 24-hour glucose dramatically better than one 45-minute walk at any other time of day, as DiPietro and colleagues reported in Diabetes Care in 2013. The same total walking duration, the same total energy expenditure, different timing. The walk during the glucose peak intercepts the spike at its source, pulling glucose into the muscle while the concentration is highest. The walk at a random hour misses the window entirely. The morning walk after breakfast is the most valuable of the three because the overnight fast has primed the highest spike and the insulin pathway is at its least responsive. The GLUT4 transporter reaches the membrane either way. The glucose it encounters on arrival determines whether the translocation cleared a dangerous spike or moved molecules that were already sitting at baseline. And then, here is where the walk separates from every other input in the morning. Because the walk feeds backward into every system the morning has already restored, amplifying the compensation each one delivered. The compounding runs through 5 separate pathways, each one tracing back to a specific input the walk extends. Improved insulin sensitivity from glucose clearance extends the window during which amino acids from the morning protein circulate at usable concentrations. When insulin sensitivity rises, the body's amino acid clearance slows, keeping leucine in circulation longer. The 3 to 5 hour synthesis window the protein section described stretches because the substrate the ribosomes need stays available at the concentrations mTOR requires. The window extends. Without the walk, amino acids clear faster, leucine drops below the threshold sooner, and the synthesis window closes before the muscle finish building. The difference between a 4-hour synthesis window and a 2-hour window is the difference between the muscle adding measurable contractile protein from that meal and the meal producing half the structural repair it could have. The walk compounds the 5th input. Continued rhythmic movement maintains the fascial shear that the 60 seconds of oscillation initiated. Fascia that melted at 7 stays fluid at 8 because the walking sustains the mechanical input that prevents regelation. The lubricant that gelled overnight and was liquefied by the morning oscillation requires continuous shear to stay fluid. Stop moving for 30 minutes and the thixotropic gelation restarts, the molecular chains re-encountering each other in the reduced volume and cross-linking back into the gel state. Walking extends the fluid window through the entire morning, which means the muscles that were pulling against adhesion at 6:55 are sliding freely through their full range at 8:30. Outdoors, melanopsin receives a second circadian reinforcement from direct sunlight, strengthening the calibration. The second input delivered through a lens that filtered part of the signal. The clocks tighten. The peripheral clocks that locked onto the first calibration receive a confirming signal that extends the coherence window deeper into the afternoon. Every hour of tighter synchronization downstream means insulin sensitivity, cortisol cycling, and melatonin onset stay closer to their optimal timing through the day. The calibration compounds. BDNF released during the walk crosses the blood-brain barrier and stimulates neurogenesis in the hippocampal tissue that the trigeminal volley from hard chewing already primed. Three inputs converge: light and movement and chewing, feeding the same hippocampal tissue through three separate pathways within a single hour. Morning shear stress activates eNOS, the enzyme inside the vessel wall that produces nitric oxide. Blood flow bends the glycolysis. The enzyme fires, and the arterial compliance that results persists through the entire day. The vascular dilution, the first input's cold water began, now circulates through vessels whose walls are actively producing the vasodilator that keeps them compliant. Two mechanisms operating on a shared vascular bed simultaneously: the volume expansion from water absorption and the endothelial relaxation from nitric oxide production. Neither one depends on the other. Both are more valuable after 50 because the baseline vascular stiffness they counteract has been increasing for decades. A vessel wall that receives shear stress at 8 in the morning is still producing nitric oxide at 8 in the evening. 12 hours of vascular protection from 15 minutes of contraction. The morning's first glass of cold water and its last 15 minutes of walking converge on shared vessels through different physics, every input, and the last one multiplied the other 5. I use a continuous glucose monitor. The mornings when the walk happens within 20 minutes of the last bite, the glucose trace barely rises above baseline before contraction pulls it back down. Delayed by an hour, the trace spikes, plateaus, and takes twice as long to return. The mornings when there is no walk at all, the spike reaches its full height and the glycation chemistry runs unchecked for 90 minutes. The difference on the monitor is striking. The difference in how the afternoon feels is the part the monitor cannot capture. 55 protocols behind these inputs with specific timing and dosing for each are in the document below. Every input, every system, every compensation, each one routes around the decline by activating a component the decline did not touch, and the benefit grows disproportionately with age. A receptor operating at full capacity inside a system running at 60% compensates for more deficit than that receptor inside a system at 90%. The morning that matters most is the morning where the gap is widest. The forgiveness stopped decades ago, and what remains is the physics. It has not changed. The margin underneath it has.